The widow hired a woman to clean graves, then froze when she found her husband's name already etched in stone. The stagecoach wheels had barely stopped turning when Martha Henley stepped down into the dust of Cedar Flats. The town stretched before her like a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. Wooden buildings leaning against each other for support, their paint peeling under the weight of too many summers. She pulled her shawl tighter and lifted her worn leather satchel, feeling the familiar weight of everything she carried inside. The driver tossed her trunk down without ceremony. "End of the line, ma'am," he said, already turning his attention to the horses. Martha nodded and watched the stage roll away, taking with it the last thread connecting her to the life she'd left behind in Kansas. The dust settled slowly, like thoughts she'd been trying to bury. Cedar Flats wasn't much to look at, but that suited her fine. She needed a place where nobody asked questions about a woman traveling alone, where the past stayed buried deep as winter roots. The boarding house sat at the end of Main Street, its sign creaking in the evening wind. Martha walked toward it, her footsteps soft on the packed earth. Mrs. Coleman, the boarding housekeeper, was a thin woman with kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving. She showed Martha to a small room on the second floor, with a window that looked out over the edge of town toward the cemetery on the hill. "Most folks don't like that view," Mrs. Coleman said, adjusting the curtains. "But it's peaceful, I suppose." "Quiet." Martha set her satchel on the narrow bed. "Quiet suits me just fine." That first night, she lay awake listening to the town settle into sleep. Dogs barking in the distance, the creak of wood cooling after the day's heat, and something else, a stillness that seemed to come from the cemetery itself, as if the dead were holding their breath. In the morning, Martha walked through town with her head up but her eyes careful. She needed work, something that would keep her hands busy and her mind from wandering down dark paths. The general store owner mentioned the cemetery, how it had been neglected since Old Tom, who used to tend it, had died the winter before. The headstones were getting hard to read, covered in years of dust and weather. "Shame, really," the store owner said, weighing out her flour. "Some of those graves go back 30 years. History just washing away." Martha paid for her supplies and walked up the hill. The cemetery sat on a ridge overlooking the valley, surrounded by a low stone wall that had gaps where winter frost had pushed the rocks apart. Wild grass grew between the graves, and many of the headstones were indeed hard to read, their carved names softened by wind and rain. She counted maybe 60 graves, some marked with elaborate stone angels, others with simple wooden crosses that leaned at tired angles. It was work that would take weeks, maybe months, work that would keep her close to something that understood silence. The next day, she found Rose. The girl was maybe 20, with dark hair that she kept braided down her back and hands that looked like they knew hard work. She was hanging laundry behind the seamstress shop when Martha approached her. "I'm looking for someone to help me clean the cemetery," Martha said. "It pays fair, but it's not easy work." Rose looked up from the wet sheets she was pinning to the line. Her eyes were the color of sage after rain, serious and steady. "I don't mind hard work," she said, "and I don't mind the dead. They're quieter than the living." Something in the girl's voice told Martha she understood about needing quiet places. They agreed on wages, enough to help Rose with her rent at the boarding house, enough for Martha to feel she was doing something useful with the money that weighed so heavy in her satchel. They started work the next morning. Martha brought rags and brushes, a bucket for water from the well at the cemetery's edge. Rose brought silence and steady hands. They worked without talking much, moving from stone to stone, scrubbing away years of neglect. The older graves were the hardest to clean. The stone was softer, and the carved letters had worn shallow. Martha found herself squinting to make out names and dates, running her fingers over the worn surface to feel what she couldn't see. Mary Sullivan, beloved wife. James Morrison, gone too soon. Sarah Chun, age 6. Each name was someone's heartbreak carved in stone. Rose worked with a gentleness that made Martha think the girl had lost someone too. She cleaned each stone as if it mattered, as if the person sleeping beneath could feel the kindness in her touch. When they found a grave of a child, Rose would gather the small wildflowers that grew nearby and placed them on the stone, never saying why. For 3 days they worked this way, the silence between them comfortable as old leather. Martha began to think she might have found what she was looking for: honest work, a quiet companion, a place where her secrets could rest undisturbed. Then Rose found the stone that changed everything. It was tucked behind a larger monument, hidden by a tangle of wild rose bushes that had grown thick and thorny. Rose was working carefully to clear the vines away when she stopped, her hand frozen on her brush. "Mrs. Henley," she said, and her voice was different now, careful as footsteps on thin ice. "You need to see this." Martha set down her bucket and walked over. Rose had cleared enough of the stone to reveal the carved name, and Martha felt the world tilt sideways like a wagon with a broken wheel. Thomas Henley, the stone read. Beloved husband, 1847 to 1884. Martha stared at the carved letters, her heart beating so loud she was sure Rose could hear it. Thomas Henley. Her husband's name, carved in stone, dated 2 years in the future from when he'd actually died. 2 years beyond the night she'd left him bleeding in the dirt outside a saloon in Dodge City. "Mom." Rose's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You all right?" Martha reached out and touched the stone with shaking fingers. The carving was fresh, the edges sharp and clean. Someone had put this here recently, someone who knew she was coming, someone who knew what she'd done. The leather satchel suddenly felt like it weighed 100 pounds, heavy with the money she'd taken from Thomas's body that night, the money she'd told herself was payment for 2 years of bruises and fear. But looking at his name carved in stone like a promise, she wondered if some debts followed you no matter how far you ran. Rose was watching her with those sage-colored eyes, waiting for an explanation that Martha didn't know how to give. The afternoon sun slanted through the rose bushes, casting shadows that looked like fingers pointing at secrets that should have stayed buried. Martha pulled her hand back from the stone and looked at the young woman who'd trusted her enough to share this quiet work. She saw in Rose's face the question that would have to be answered, the reckoning that was coming whether she was ready for it or not. Rose didn't ask the question right away. She finished cleaning around Thomas Henley's stone with the same gentle care she showed all the graves, as if giving Martha time to find words for what couldn't be explained. The afternoon stretched long between them, filled with the sound of brushes on stone and the distant call of a meadowlark. When the sun began to sink toward the western hills, Rose finally set down her bucket and looked at Martha with those steady sage eyes. "That's your husband's name on the stone," she said. It wasn't a question. Martha's hands stilled on the rag she'd been wringing out. "Yes, but the date says 1884. That's 2 years from now." Martha nodded, unable to find her voice. The stone seemed to watch her, Thomas's name carved deep and permanent, like an accusation that wouldn't fade. Rose sat down on a flat gravestone, her skirts settling around her like water finding its level. "Somebody put this here recent," she said. "The carving's fresh, and the stone's clean underneath all those roses. I know. Somebody who knows you're here. Somebody who knows about your husband." Martha felt the weight of it then, the burden she'd been carrying across 3 states and 2 years of running. She sank down beside Rose, her legs suddenly too weak to hold her upright. Around them, the cemetery held its breath, as if the dead were leaning forward to listen. "His name was Thomas Henley," Martha began, her voice barely louder than the wind through the grass. "We were married 8 years. He wasn't a kind man." Rose nodded, asking nothing with her silence. Martha closed her eyes and let the memory take her back to that night in Dodge City. The saloon had been loud with laughter and piano music, the air thick with smoke and whiskey breath. Thomas had been drinking since noon, celebrating a cattle sale that had gone better than expected. By evening, he was mean drunk, the kind that made his hands quick and his words cruel. He liked to gamble, Martha continued, but he wasn't good at it. That night, he'd lost most of what we'd made on the cattle. All of it, really, except for what I'd hidden away for supplies. She touched her leather satchel, remembering the weight of those coins. When he found out I kept money back, he got angry. Real angry. The beating had been worse than usual. Thomas had used his belt that time, and his boots when she'd fallen. Martha had crawled behind the bar, begging him to stop, but the whiskey had made him deaf to everything except his own rage. "There was a man there," Martha said. "A stranger passing through. He tried to step in, tried to get Thomas to leave me be." She opened her eyes and looked at Rose. Thomas pulled his gun. The stranger had been young, maybe Rose's age, with honest eyes and hands that shook when Thomas pointed the Colt at his chest. The saloon had gone quiet then, everyone waiting to see if blood would spill on the sawdust floor. "Thomas was drunk enough to shoot," Martha said. "I could see it in his eyes. He was going to kill that boy for trying to help me." So Martha had picked up the stranger's gun from where it had fallen when Thomas knocked him down. Her hands had been steady, steadier than they'd ever been before. She'd pointed it at her husband's back and pulled the trigger. "I shot him," she whispered. "Shot him dead in front of half the town." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet they'd shared while working. This silence was full of judgment waiting to be passed, of trust that might be broken. Rose picked up a small stone and turned it over in her palm. "What happened after?" "The sheriff came. Everyone said it was self-defense, that Thomas would have killed that young man sure as sunrise. Nobody mourned him much." Martha's voice was flat now, empty of feeling. "But I knew what I'd done. I knew I'd want to kill him, had been wanting to for years." The stranger had lived. He'd helped Martha gather what little she owned and had walked her to the edge of town. Before they parted ways, he'd pressed something into her hand, a folded piece of paper with an address written in careful script. "Cedar Flats," Martha said. "He told me it was a good place for new beginnings. Said he had family there, people who'd help a woman starting over." Rose was quiet for a long time, watching the stone in her palm catch the last light. "You took his money," she said finally. Martha nodded. "Everything he had on him. Told myself it was payment for what he'd put me through. But money taken from a dead man." She shrugged. "It never feels clean." The sun was setting now, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and shadow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild. Martha felt exposed, sitting there among the graves, her secret finally spoken aloud. "So somebody knows," Rose said. "Somebody who was there that night, or somebody who heard tell of it. And they put this stone here to let you know they know." "Seems like it." Rose stood and brushed the dust from her skirts. She walked to Thomas Henley's grave and stood looking down at it, her face thoughtful in the dying light. "You ever think maybe you did the right thing?" she asked. Martha looked up, surprised. "I killed my husband. You stopped him from killing an innocent man. You stopped him from beating you again." Rose turned back to Martha. Sometimes the right thing and the wrong thing were the same face. The words settled between them like seeds finding soil. Martha had never thought of it that way, had never allowed herself to consider that her actions might have been anything other than murder, dressed up in self-defense. "My father used to beat my mother," Rose said quietly. "Beat her until she was too scared to leave the house, too scared to speak above a whisper. She died when I was 16, just gave up and died. I used to wish somebody had been brave enough to stop him." The two women looked at each other across the gathering dusk, understanding passing between them like water, finding its level. In Rose's eyes, Martha saw not judgment, but something that looked almost like respect. As they walked back toward town, their tools gathered in the cemetery settling into evening peace, Martha felt something shift inside her chest. The weight was still there, but it had changed somehow, become something she might learn to carry instead of something that would eventually crush her. But the stone remained, Thomas's name carved deep and waiting, and Martha knew that whoever had put it there wasn't finished with her yet. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as steady as heartbeats. Martha and Rose would meet each morning at the cemetery gate, their tools and water buckets in hand, and work until the sun grew too hot to bear. Then they'd rest in the shade of the old oak tree that grew near the center of the graveyard, sharing whatever food they'd brought and watching the valley spread out below them like a patchwork quilt. Martha found herself looking forward to these quiet hours more than she'd expected. Rose had a way of being present without being demanding, of listening without judging. She never asked more questions about Thomas or that night in Dodge City. But her acceptance of what Martha had told her felt like cool water on a burn. They worked on the older graves first, the ones where the names had nearly disappeared under years of weather. Martha would trace the faded letters with her finger, while Rose held a wet cloth ready to clean away the grime. Together, they brought the dead back to the light of day, one careful stroke at a time. "Look at this one," Rose said one morning, kneeling beside a small headstone shaped like a lamb. Emma Catherine Morrison, only 3 years old. Martha knelt beside her and read the inscription below the dates. Taken by fever, 1878. Our little lamb has gone to greener pastures. They worked in silence for a while, Rose's hands gentle on the carved lamb's face. Martha watched her and thought about the mother who had chosen those words, who tried to find comfort in the idea of her baby girl running free somewhere beyond the sky. "You ever want children?" Rose asked suddenly. Martha's cloth stilled on the stone. "Once. Long time ago." She looked up at the clouds moving slow across the blue. "Thomas didn't. Said they'd just be another mouth to feed, another burden to carry." Rose nodded, understanding passing between them without need for more words. She had her own empty spaces, Martha could tell, her own dreams that had been put aside or taken away. As the days passed, they began to share more than just the work. Rose would bring extra biscuits from the boarding house kitchen, and Martha would add a bit of honey she'd bought at the general store. They'd sit among the graves and eat in comfortable silence, watching hawks circle high above the valley. "My mother used to make bread like this," Martha said one afternoon, breaking off a piece of Rose's biscuit. "Every Sunday morning, the whole house would smell like yeast and flour." "What happened to her?" Rose asked. "Died when I was 15. Lung fever." Martha chewed slowly, tasting memory mixed with grain. "My father remarried quick. New wife didn't much care for me hanging around, so I married Thomas the year after. Seemed like the thing to do." Rose was quiet for a moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a small apple, red as sunset. She cut it in half with her knife and handed Martha a piece. Sometimes the thing that seems right at the time turns out to be the thing that nearly kills you. Martha bit into the apple, sweet and tart on her tongue. "And sometimes you don't know you're dying until you're almost gone." They understood each other, she and Rose. Both had learned that survival sometimes meant making choices that left scars, that the space between right and wrong was often wider than it looked from a distance. The cemetery was slowly coming back to life under their care. The grass grew neat and green around the headstones now, and the marble angels stood clean and white in the afternoon sun. Martha found herself taking pride in the work, in the way the names emerged from shadow into daylight, in the small flowers Rose would place on the children's graves. "We're giving them back their dignity," Rose said one evening as they stood looking over their progress. "Letting them be remembered proper." Martha nodded, thinking of all the ways a person could be forgotten, how easy it was to disappear even while you were still breathing. She thought of the woman she'd been before Thomas, young and full of hope, and wondered if that girl was buried somewhere too, waiting for gentle hands to clean away the years of dust. 2 weeks into their routine, Martha began to feel something she'd almost forgotten: peace. Not the brutal kind that came from running away, but something deeper, rooted in the soil of honest work and unexpected friendship. She found herself sleeping better, dreaming less of gunfire and more of clean stone and wildflowers. But peace, as Martha had learned, was a fragile thing. She was working alone that Thursday morning. Rose had taken sick with a summer cold, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats on the road below. She looked up from the grave. She was tending to see a rider coming up the hill, moving slow and deliberate like a man who knew exactly where he was going. Martha's hands went still on her cleaning rag. Even from a distance, something about the way the man sat his horse was familiar, the set of his shoulders against the morning sky. As he drew closer, she could make out more details: the black hat pulled low, the long coat despite the heat, the careful way he guided his horse between the graves. When he was close enough for her to see his face, Martha's breath caught in her throat. She knew those eyes, pale blue as winter ice. She knew that thin mouth and the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. She'd seen him twice in her life. Once in the Dodge City saloon the night she'd shot Thomas, and once more the next morning when he'd helped her gather her things and given her the paper with Cedar Flats written on it. The stranger who'd nearly died trying to protect her. The one she'd saved by killing her husband. He pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet away and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, Mrs. Henley." Martha stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Morning." He dismounted with the easy grace of a man who'd spent most of his life in the saddle, then tied his horse to the cemetery fence. When he turned back to her, his expression was serious but not unkind. "Name's Jake Morrison," he said. "Don't know if you remember me." "I remember." Martha's voice came out barely above a whisper. "You're the one who told me about this place." Jake nodded and looked around the cemetery, his gaze taking in the clean headstones and neat grass. "Looks like you've made good use of the time here." This place needed tending. He walked closer, and Martha saw that his right hand rested easy on the grip of the gun at his hip. Not threatening, but ready. "Always ready. I expect you're wondering why I'm here," he said. Martha felt the weight of her leather satchel, still heavy with Thomas's money after all this time. She thought of Rose, safe in her boarding house room with her summer cold, and felt grateful the girl wasn't here to see this moment arrive. "I've been wondering when someone would come," she said. "Been wondering since I found that stone with Thomas's name on it." Jake's eyes followed her gaze to the grave hidden behind the rose bushes. "That wasn't me who put it there," he said quietly, "but I know who did." The morning seemed to hold its breath around them, the dead listening from their beds of earth and stone, waiting to see what the living would choose to do with the truth. Jake Morrison stood among the graves like a man who'd been carrying a burden too long. Martha watched him look around the cemetery, taking in the work she and Rose had done, the way the headstones caught the morning light clean and proud. "Thomas had a brother," Jake said finally. "Name of Samuel. He's the one put that stone here." Martha felt her heart sink like a rock dropped in deep water. She'd known Thomas had family back in Missouri, but they'd never visited, never written. She'd hoped they'd forgotten he ever existed. "Samuel came looking for Thomas about 6 months back," Jake continued. "Found out what happened in Dodge City. Found out about you." The morning air felt thin, hard to breathe. Martha sank down onto a low stone wall, her legs suddenly weak. "What does he want?" Jake's hand moved away from his gun, and he crouched down so they were at eye level. His pale eyes were serious but not unkind. "He wants the money, Martha. And he wants you to pay for what you did. The money's not his. Maybe not by law, but Samuel sees it different. Says Thomas earned that money, and it belongs to family." Jake paused, studying her face. "He also says what you did wasn't self-defense. Says you murdered his brother for his gold." Martha thought of the leather satchel back in her room, still heavy with coins that had never felt clean in her hands. She'd spent barely any of it, living careful and small, as if using Thomas's money would make her more guilty than she already felt. "Where is he now?" she asked. "Coming up from the valley. Should be here within the hour." Jake stood and walked to Thomas's hidden grave, pushing aside the rose branches to look at the carved name. "He's not a reasonable man, Martha. Not like Thomas was reasonable." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Martha understood. Samuel Henley had come for blood, not just money. "You could run," Jake said quietly. "I could tell him you'd already moved on, that I never found you." Martha looked around the cemetery, at all the stones she and Rose had cleaned, at the small flowers growing on the children's graves. For the first time in 2 years, she'd found a place where she could sleep without fear, work without shame. The thought of leaving it all behind felt like dying a little. "Why would you help me?" she asked. "You don't owe me anything. If anything, I owe you." Jake was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the carved letters of Thomas's name. "My sister was married to a man like Thomas," he said. "Beat her regular, kept her locked up like a caged bird. She died young, broken inside where nobody could see." He looked up at Martha. "When I saw you pull that trigger, I thought maybe somebody finally had the courage to do what needed doing. Footsteps on the cemetery path made them both turn. Rose was walking up the hill, moving slow but steady despite her cold. Her sage-colored eyes took in the scene. Martha sitting on the wall, Jake standing by the hidden grave, the tension thick as summer heat between them. "Morning," she said, setting down her bucket. "I'm feeling better." Martha stood quickly. "Rose, you should go back to town. There's going to be trouble here." But Rose looked at Jake, then at Martha, and Martha saw understanding dawn in her eyes. "This is about Thomas," Rose said. It wasn't a question. "His brother's coming," Martha said. "He wants the money, and he wants justice." Rose wiped her hands on her apron and walked to stand beside Martha. "Then we'll wait for him together." "Rose, no. This isn't your fight." "Maybe not." Rose looked around the cemetery, at all the work they'd done together. "But this is my place too now. These are my graves to tend, my peace to protect." Jake watched this exchange with something that might have been approval. "Samuel's not going to listen to reason," he warned. "He's got it in his head that Martha's a murderer who needs hanging." "And what do you think?" Rose asked him directly. Jake considered this, his pale eyes moving from Rose to Martha and back again. "I think sometimes the law and what's right don't walk the same path. I think Martha did what she had to do to save my life and stop a bad man for doing more harm." The sound of horses on the road below reached them then. 3 riders, moving fast up the hill toward the cemetery. Martha felt her mouth go dry, but she didn't move from where she stood. She was tired of running, tired of carrying guilt like stones in her pockets. Samuel Henley looked like his brother, but where Thomas had been cruel, Samuel was cold. His eyes were dark as winter shadows, and his mouth was set in a line that suggested he'd never smiled in his life. The 2 men with him sat their horses like they'd done this kind of work before, hired guns with empty eyes and steady hands. Samuel dismounted and walked through the cemetery gate without invitation. His gaze swept over the clean stones and neat grass, then settled on Martha with the weight of judgment already past. "Martha Henley," he said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "You're a hard woman to find." "Not that hard," Martha replied. "I've been right here, tending this place." Samuel's eyes found Jake, and something passed between the 2 men that Martha couldn't read. "Morrison, didn't expect to see you here. Figured somebody ought to make sure this stays civil," Jake said easily, but Martha noticed his hand resting on his gun again. Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Civil? My brother's dead, and this woman's been living off his money for 2 years. Nothing civil about that." He walked to where the roses hid Thomas's grave and pushed them aside, revealing the carved headstone. "Put this here myself, soon as I found out where she'd run to. Wanted Thomas to have something proper, even if it's not where his body lies." Martha felt Rose move closer beside her, a solid presence in the growing tension. "Your brother was trying to kill an innocent man," Martha said. "I stopped him. You murdered him." Samuel's voice was quiet, deadly. "Shot him in the back like a coward. He was going to kill Jake Morrison. He was drunk and mean, and he would have pulled that trigger." Samuel turned to look at Jake. "That true, Morrison? You needed a woman to save you." Jake's eyes went cold as winter sky. "Your brother was a drunk and a bully, Samuel. You know it as well as I do. Martha saved my life, and probably saved others he would have hurt down the line." The 2 hired guns had dismounted now, flanking Samuel like bookends. Martha could see the way they watched Jake, the way their hands hovered near their weapons. This was going to end in blood unless somebody found another way. "I'll give you the money," Martha said suddenly. "All of it. I never wanted it anyway." Samuel smiled then, and it was worse than his frown. "Oh, you'll give it back. But that's just the start of what you owe." Rose stepped forward then, small but fierce as a cornered wildcat. "She doesn't owe you anything more than that money. She stopped a bad man from doing more harm. That's not murder. That's justice." Samuel's dark eyes fixed on Rose. "And who might you be?" "Someone who knows the difference between a victim and a villain," Rose said steadily. The moment stretched taut as a drawn bowstring. Martha could hear birds singing in the distance, could smell the roses that grew over Thomas's grave. All around them, the dead waited in their beds of earth, patient as stone. Then Jake spoke, his voice cutting through the tension like a clean blade. "Samuel, you've got a choice to make. You can take the money and ride out of here, or you can try to take more than that and see how it plays out." Samuel looked at the three of them, Martha, Rose, and Jake, standing together among the graves they'd tended with such care. Martha saw him calculating, weighing his chances against Jake's reputation and the determination in Rose's eyes. Finally, he nodded toward one of his men. "Get the money from her." Martha looked at Rose, at Jake, at the cemetery where she'd found something like peace. Then she walked to where she'd left her satchel by the oak tree and brought it back. She opened it and pulled out the leather pouch that held Thomas's coins, heavy and cold in her hands. "Here," she said, holding it out to Samuel. "Take it and go." Samuel took the money, weighed it in his palm, then tucked it inside his coat. "This settles the debt," he said, "but not the crime." He reached for his gun then, but Jake was faster. The sound of the hammer being pulled back seemed loud as thunder in the cemetery quiet. "Samuel," Jake said softly, "don't." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other across the graves. Then Samuel slowly let his hand fall to his side. "This ain't over," he said to Martha. "Yes, it is," Rose said with quiet certainty. "She paid what she owed. The rest is just hate talking, and hate doesn't get to make the rules here." Samuel looked around the cemetery one more time, his gaze lingering on his brother's headstone. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. His hired guns followed, and within minutes they were riding back down the hill, leaving dust and silence in their wake. Martha sank down onto Thomas's grave, her legs finally giving out. The weight of the money was gone from her satchel, but she felt lighter than she had in years. Rose sat down beside her, and Jake lowered his gun. "That was well done," he said to both women, "standing your ground like that." Martha looked at the headstone with Thomas's name carved deep and permanent. "Strange thing is, I'm glad it's here. Glad he has something to mark his passing, even if he wasn't a good man." Rose picked a wild rose from the bush and placed it on the grave. "Even bad men were somebody's son once," she said. "Even they deserve to be remembered." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the three of them sat among the graves in comfortable silence. Martha thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the weight of secrets and the lighter weight of truth shared with friends. She'd come to Cedar Flats carrying guilt and running from judgment. But sitting there in the cemetery she'd helped bring back to life, surrounded by stones that marked both sorrow and love, Martha realized that peace wasn't something you found. It was something you build day by day, choice by choice, with your own two hands and the help of those who cared enough to stand beside you when the dust settled and the truth came calling. In the distance, a church bell was ringing, calling people to Sunday service. Martha listened to its clear, sweet sound and thought that maybe for the first time in a very long time, she might just answer that call.